In the fall of 1971, a 25-year-old woman walked into the economics department at Yale University to begin her PhD program. She was brilliant. She had graduated summa cum laude from Brown University. She had scored at the top of her class on every exam. She had been recommended by the best professors in the field. And she was the only woman in the room. Her name was Janet Yellen, and she had no idea that she would one day become the most powerful economist in the world. The first woman to chair the Federal Reserve, the first woman to lead the U.S. Treasury Department, and the only person in American history to hold all three of the nation's top economic positions. This is the story of how a Jewish girl from Brooklyn, whose grandparents fled Poland to escape persecution, became the woman who controls America's money. But more importantly, it's the story of how she did it, the specific insights, the deliberate choices, the relentless focus on what other economists ignored, and how she used that power not to enrich herself, but to help the people who needed it most. It's also the story of what happens when you're told you don't belong, and you prove them wrong anyway. Janet Louise Yellen was born on August 13, 1946, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, New York. Her parents, Julius and Anna Ruth Yellen, were the children of Polish-Jewish immigrants who had come to America in the early 20th century. They had fled the pogroms, the discrimination, the violence that made life unbearable for Jews in Eastern Europe. They came to America with nothing, built lives from scratch, and gave their children opportunities they never had. Julius Yellen became a family physician, but he didn't work at a hospital or a clinic. He had his medical practice on the ground floor of the family's home in Bay Ridge. Patients would come to the house. Julius would see them in his office, then go upstairs for dinner with his family. It was a modest life, not poor but not wealthy. Julius charged what his patients could afford, which often wasn't much. He treated everyone, the Irish dock workers, the Italian shopkeepers, the Jewish families who lived in the neighborhood. He believed that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. Janet's mother, Anna Ruth, had been an elementary school teacher. She loved teaching. She was good at it. But when Janet and her older brother John were born, Anna Ruth gave up her career to stay home and raise her children. It was what women did in the 1940s and 1950s. You chose career or family, not both. Janet watched her mother give up something she loved. She watched her father work long hours for modest pay because he believed in serving his community. And she absorbed a lesson that would define her entire career, that your work should be about more than just making money. It should be about helping people. But there was another lesson Janet learned early, one that was harder and more painful. She learned that the world didn't want her. When Janet was ready for high school, her parents looked into the elite private schools in New York City. Janet was brilliant. Everyone could see that. She excelled at mathematics. She read voraciously. She asked questions that made her teachers pause and think. The elite schools would give her opportunities, better teachers, better resources, better connections. But the elite schools had a problem with Janet. Not with her grades, not with her test scores, not with her recommendations. They had a problem with her last name. In the 1950s and early 1960s, elite private schools in New York and elite universities across America had Jewish quotas. They would admit a certain number of Jewish students, usually around 10 to 15%, and no more. It didn't matter how qualified you were. If the quota was filled, you were out. The quotas weren't official. They weren't written down, but everyone knew they existed. Janet's parents applied to several elite schools. Janet was rejected from all of them. So Janet went to Fort Hamilton High School, the regular public school in her Bay Ridge neighborhood. No prestige, no connections, just a neighborhood school with working-class kids whose parents couldn't afford private education. And it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her. At Fort Hamilton, Janet thrived. She took every advanced class available. She joined the math team. She worked harder than everyone else because she knew she had to. She didn't have the advantages of the elite school kids. She would have to earn everything. She graduated as valedictorian. Years later, people would describe Janet's path to Fort Hamilton as serendipitous. They would say she got an excellent education there, that it prepared her well for college. But think about what that really means. Janet got an excellent education at a public school because the elite schools wouldn't take her. She succeeded not because of the system, but in spite of it. And she never forgot that. She never forgot what it felt like to be told you're not good enough because of who you are, not what you can do. Janet went to Pembroke College, the women's college within Brown University. She majored in economics. She graduated summa cum laude. Then she applied to graduate school. She was accepted to Yale University's economics PhD program. And when she showed up in the fall of 1971, she discovered she was the only woman in the program. Not one of a few women, not one of several, the only one. Think about what that means. meetings. Every seminar, she was the only woman. Every study group, she was the only woman. Every conference, every presentation, every casual conversation in the hallway, she was the only woman. The men didn't know what to make of her. Some ignored her. Some patronized her. Some assumed she was there because of affirmative action, not because she was brilliant. Janet didn't have female role models. There were no women professors in the economics department. There were no senior women economists to mentor her. She was navigating entirely on her own. But she had one advantage: her advisor. James Tobin was one of the most respected economists in the world. He would win the Nobel Prize in 1981, and he believed in Janet. He saw her brilliance. He pushed her to think bigger, to challenge assumptions, to ask questions that other economists weren't asking. Janet's dissertation was titled "Employment, Output, and Capital Accumulation in an Open Economy: A Disequilibrium Approach." It was technical, rigorous, and innovative. It examined what happens when economies are out of equilibrium, when supply and demand don't match, when unemployment persists, when markets don't clear. It was also deeply human, because Janet wasn't just interested in abstract models. She was interested in what happened to real people when the economy failed them. This was Janet's first major insight. Economics isn't just about numbers and models. It's about people, their jobs, their wages, their ability to feed their families and build lives. She finished her PhD in 1971. She was 25 years old. She was one of the most promising young economists in the country, and no one wanted to hire her. Janet applied for academic positions. She was rejected from most of them. She applied to Harvard. They offered her a position as a lecturer, not a tenure-track professor, a lecturer. It was the kind of position they gave to people they didn't think would make it. A temporary job, a consolation prize. Janet took it because she didn't have a choice. For 5 years, from 1971 to 1976, Janet taught at Harvard. She was brilliant in the classroom. Students loved her. She explained complex concepts with clarity. She made economics accessible. But Harvard didn't offer her tenure. They didn't even offer her a tenure-track position. Years later, people would speculate about why. Was it because she was a woman? Was it because she was Jewish? Was it because her work didn't fit the dominant paradigms of the time? Probably all three. But here's what's remarkable. Janet didn't give up. She didn't become bitter. She didn't leave economics. She kept working. In 1977, she got her first opportunity at the Federal Reserve. She was hired as an economist for the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. It was a one-year position, but it changed everything. At the Fed, Janet saw how monetary policy actually worked. She saw how decisions made in Washington affected real people, their jobs, their mortgages, their ability to send their kids to college. She saw the power of central banking, and she saw how that power could be used to help people or hurt them. And she saw something else. She saw that most economists at the Fed were focused on inflation. They worried constantly about prices rising. They would raise interest rates to fight inflation, even if it meant putting people out of work. But Janet started asking a different question. What about the people who lose their jobs? What about the human cost of fighting inflation? This was Janet's second transformative insight. Unemployment isn't just a statistic, it's a human tragedy, and preventing unemployment should be just as important as preventing inflation. It was a radical idea in the 1970s. Most economists believed that a little unemployment was necessary to keep inflation in check. They called it the natural rate of unemployment. They treated it as inevitable. Janet disagreed, and she would spend the rest of her career proving them wrong. In 1977, while working at the Federal Reserve, Janet met a man named George Akerlof. George was an economist, like Janet. He was brilliant, creative, and unconventional. He asked questions that other economists thought were strange. He drew from sociology, psychology, and anthropology to understand economic behavior. He was also kind. He listened. He took Janet seriously in a way that many male economists didn't. They started talking about economics, about research, about the questions that fascinated them both, and they fell in love. Janet and George married in 1978. They would have one son, Robert, who would also become an economist. But more importantly, they became research partners. Together, Janet and George developed what became known as efficiency wage theory. The theory was simple but revolutionary. Paying workers more than the market wage actually makes economic sense. When workers feel they're being paid fairly, they work harder, they're more loyal, they're more productive, they stay with the company longer. Conversely, when workers feel underpaid, they withdraw effort, they do the minimum, they leave for other jobs. The company loses productivity and has to spend money training new workers. Most economists believe that wages should be set by supply and demand. If there are more workers than jobs, wages should fall. That's how markets work. But Janet and George showed that this model ignored human psychology. Workers aren't just inputs in a production function. They're people with feelings, with a sense of fairness, with expectations about how they should be treated. This was Janet's third crucial insight. You can't understand economics without understanding human behavior, and you can't understand human behavior by treating people like machines. The efficiency wage theory was published in a series of papers in the 1980s. It was controversial. Many economists dismissed it as too soft, too focused on psychology instead of mathematics. But it turned out to be right. Study after study confirmed that paying workers fairly improves productivity. Companies like Costco and Trader Joe's built their entire business models around it, and Janet's work became foundational in labor economics. In 2001, George Akerlof won the Nobel Prize in Economics. His work on information asymmetry, how markets fail when one party has more information than another, was groundbreaking. But George always said that his collaboration with Janet was just as important. They pushed each other, they challenged each other, they made each other better, and Janet was building something else, a reputation, not as someone's wife, not as a woman economist, but as one of the most insightful economic minds of her generation. After her year at the Federal Reserve, Janet taught at the London School of Economics for 2 years. Then, in 1980, she joined the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley. Berkeley was different from Harvard. It was more open, more diverse, more willing to consider unconventional ideas. Janet thrived there. She taught, she published, she mentored students. But Janet wasn't satisfied staying in the university. She wanted to affect real policy. She wanted to use her knowledge to help real people. In 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed Janet to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. She served for 3 years, from 1994 to 1997. Then, in 1997, Clinton asked her to chair the Council of Economic Advisors. It was one of the top economic positions in the federal government. Janet would advise the president directly on economic policy. She accepted. For 2 years, from 1997 to 1999, Janet helped shape economic policy during one of the most prosperous periods in American history. Unemployment fell, wages rose, the budget deficit turned into a surplus. But Janet never forgot her core insight, that economic policy should be judged by how it affects real people, especially those at the bottom. In 2004, Janet was appointed president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. It was one of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and one of the most important. And then, in 2007, the financial crisis hit. The 2008 financial crisis was the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. The stock market crashed. Millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. Janet, as president of the San Francisco Fed, had a front-row seat to the catastrophe. She saw the devastation. She saw families losing everything. She saw the human cost of financial recklessness. And she saw something else. She saw that the Federal Reserve's response was too slow, too cautious, too focused on protecting banks instead of protecting people. In 2010, President Barack Obama appointed Janet as vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board, serving under Chairman Ben Bernanke. For 4 years, Janet helped shape the Fed's response to the crisis. She advocated for keeping interest rates low to encourage hiring. She pushed for quantitative easing, buying government bonds to inject money into the economy. She argued that the Fed should focus on getting people back to work, even if it meant risking slightly higher inflation. Many economists disagreed. They worried about inflation. They worried about overheating the economy. They wanted to raise interest rates to be safe. But Janet held firm. She understood something that many economists didn't, that the real threat wasn't inflation. It was unemployment. It was millions of people unable to find work, unable to support their families, unable to build lives. This was Janet's fourth transformative insight. In a crisis, the greatest risk is doing too little, not too much. When people are suffering, you act boldly. And she was right. The Fed's aggressive response helped pull the economy out of the worst recession in 80 years. Unemployment fell. The economy recovered. And in 2013, President Obama made a historic announcement. On October 9, 2013, President Obama nominated Janet Yellen to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve Board. If confirmed, she would be the first woman to hold the position in the Federal Reserve's 100-year history. Think about that. 100 years. 15 previous chairs. All men. The confirmation hearing was intense. Senators questioned Janet for hours. They asked about monetary policy, about inflation, about financial regulation. They asked whether she was tough enough, whether she could handle the pressure, whether she could command respect. The subtext was clear. Could a woman do this job? Janet answered every question with precision and confidence. She explained her philosophy, that the Fed should focus on maximum employment as much as price stability, that unemployment has profound human costs, that monetary policy should serve all Americans, not just Wall Street. On January 6, 2014, the Senate confirmed Janet Yellen as chair of the Federal Reserve Board by a vote of 56 to 26. She was 67 years old. She had been working in economics for 43 years. She had been rejected, dismissed, and underestimated countless times. And now she was the most powerful economist in the world. Janet's tenure as Fed chair from 2014 to 2018 was remarkable. When she took office, the unemployment rate was 6.6%. When she left, it was 4.1%, the lowest in 17 years. Inflation remained low and stable. The stock market reached record highs. The economy added millions of jobs. But Janet's real achievement wasn't just the numbers. It was how she changed the Federal Reserve itself. She made the Fed more transparent. Previous Fed chairs had been secretive, cryptic, deliberately opaque. Janet believed that the American people deserved to know what the Fed was doing and why. She held regular press conferences. She explained decisions in plain language. She used the word revolution to describe the change from never explain to the current embrace of transparency. She made the Fed more focused on inequality. She commissioned studies on how Fed policies affected different groups. She spoke publicly about the profound effects that monetary policy has on both the poor and the rich. And she made the Fed more diverse. She pushed for hiring more women and minorities. She oversaw a survey that revealed widespread discrimination and harassment of women in economics. She spoke out about the need to change the culture of the field. But perhaps most importantly, she proved that you could focus on employment without creating runaway inflation. For decades, economists had believed in a trade-off. You could have low unemployment or low inflation, but not both. Janet proved them wrong. She kept interest rates low longer than many economists recommended. She prioritized getting people back to work, and inflation stayed under control. This was Janet's fifth crucial insight. The old economic models are often wrong. Don't be afraid to challenge conventional wisdom when the evidence points in a different direction. In December 2015, Janet presided over the Fed's first interest rate increase in nearly a decade. It was a historic moment, and she handled it with characteristic caution and transparency, explaining exactly why the Fed was acting and what it meant for ordinary Americans. In June 2017, Janet made a prediction that would later seem almost comical in its optimism. She said that, because of the reforms and regulations put in place after the 2008 crisis, another financial crisis was unlikely in our lifetime. She was trying to reassure the public. She was trying to show confidence in the system. But she was also making a point that regulation matters, that oversight matters, that we can prevent crises if we're willing to learn from our mistakes. In January 2018, Janet's term as Fed chair ended. President Donald Trump chose not to reappoint her, making her the first Fed chair in nearly 40 years not to serve a second term. Many saw it as political. Janet had been appointed by a Democratic president. Trump wanted his own person, but Janet didn't complain. She returned to private life. She gave speeches, she taught, she wrote. And then, in November 2020, President-elect Joe Biden made another historic announcement. He was nominating Janet Yellen to be Secretary of the Treasury. If confirmed, she would be the first woman to hold that position in the Treasury Department's 231-year history. She would also become the only person in American history to have held all three of the nation's top economic positions: Chair of the Federal Reserve, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Secretary of the Treasury, the triple crown of American economic policy. On January 26, 2021, Janet Yellen was sworn in as the 78th Secretary of the Treasury. She was 74 years old, and she was walking into another crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic had devastated the American economy. Millions of people had lost their jobs. Small businesses were closing. Families were struggling to pay rent, to buy food, to survive. Janet knew what needed to be done. The government needed to act boldly. It needed to spend money, a lot of money, to help people get through the crisis. She pushed for the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion economic relief package. It included direct payments to families, extended unemployment benefits, aid to small businesses, and money for vaccine distribution. Many economists worried about the cost. They worried about inflation. They worried about the deficit. But Janet remembered 2008. She remembered what happened when the government did too little. She remembered the years of slow recovery, the millions of people who never got their jobs back. the communities that never recovered. She wasn't going to make that mistake again. We need to rebuild the economy so that Americans can better compete in a globalized world, she said. We need to help the United States economy rebuild itself after the financial crisis set in motion by the COVID-19 pandemic. The American Rescue Plan passed, the money went out, and the economy roared back to life. Yes, inflation rose, higher than Janet had predicted, higher than most economists expected. But millions of people kept their homes. Millions of people kept food on the table. Millions of people made it through the worst pandemic in a century without falling into poverty. And Janet stood by her decision, because she understood something that many economists still don't, that the human cost of doing too little is always greater than the financial cost of doing too much. Today, Janet Yellen is 78 years old. She's been working in economics for more than 50 years. She's held the 3 most powerful economic positions in the United States government, and she's still fighting for the same thing she's always fought for: policies that help real people, especially those who need help most. But Janet's legacy isn't just about the positions she's held or the policies she's implemented. It's about what she's proven. She's proven that a woman can lead the Federal Reserve, that a woman can lead the Treasury Department, that a woman can be the most powerful economist in the world. She's proven that you can focus on employment and wages without creating runaway inflation, that you can prioritize helping people without destroying the economy. She's proven that economics doesn't have to be cold and heartless, that it can be about compassion, about fairness, about making sure that prosperity is shared. And she's proven that where you start doesn't determine where you end up. That being rejected from elite schools doesn't mean you can't achieve excellence. That being the only woman in the room doesn't mean you don't belong there. What can we learn from Janet Yellen's journey? What insights can we take from her career that apply to business, to leadership, to life? First, challenge conventional wisdom when the evidence doesn't support it. For decades, economists believed in a strict trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Janet questioned that assumption. She looked at the evidence, and she proved that the conventional wisdom was wrong. Don't accept something just because everyone knows it's true. Look at the data. Trust your analysis. Second, focus on what matters most, not what's easiest to measure. Most economists focused on inflation because it's easy to measure and track. Janet focused on unemployment because it matters more to real people. In business, it's tempting to optimize for metrics that are easy to track: clicks, views, engagement. But are those the metrics that actually matter? Are you measuring what's important or just what's convenient? Third, your disadvantages can become your advantages. Janet was rejected from elite schools because she was Jewish. She was the only woman in her PhD program. She was dismissed and underestimated throughout her career. But those experiences gave her empathy. They gave her perspective. They made her focus on people who were left out, ignored, dismissed. What looks like a disadvantage now might be the thing that makes you uniquely valuable later. Fourth, build partnerships with people who make you better. Janet's collaboration with George Akerlof wasn't just romantic. It was intellectual. They pushed each other. They challenged each other's assumptions. They created work that neither could have done alone. Find people who make you think harder, who challenge you, who bring out your best work. Fifth, transparency builds trust. Janet revolutionized Fed communications by being clear and transparent about what the Fed was doing and why. Previous chairs had been deliberately cryptic. Janet believed people deserved to know, and it worked. Trust in the Fed increased. Markets became more stable. In business, transparency isn't weakness, it's strength. Sixth, in a crisis, the greatest risk is doing too little. After 2008, Janet saw what happened when the government's response was too timid. When COVID hit, she pushed for bold action, even though it was risky. She understood that the cost of inaction is always higher than the cost of action. When your business faces a crisis, don't be cautious to the point of paralysis. Act boldly. Seventh, never forget the human cost of your decisions. Janet's defining characteristic as an economist was her focus on how policies affected real people. She never forgot that unemployment isn't just a number. It's families losing their homes, kids going hungry, dreams being destroyed. In business, it's easy to make decisions based purely on numbers, but behind every number is a person. How will your decision affect them? Eighth, patience and persistence matter more than early success. Janet was rejected from elite schools. She wasn't given tenure at Harvard. She spent decades building her reputation before reaching the top. She was 67 when she became Fed chair. Success doesn't have a timeline. Keep working, keep learning, keep improving. Ninth, use your power to open doors for others. When Janet became Fed chair, she didn't just focus on policy. She pushed for diversity. She commissioned studies on discrimination. She spoke out about the need to change the culture of economics. When you reach a position of power, use it to help others who face the same barriers you did. 10th, your work should be about more than just making money. Janet's father was a doctor who charged what his patients could afford. Her mother was a teacher who gave up her career to raise her children. Janet became an economist not to get rich, but to help people. She could have made millions in the private sector. Instead, she spent her career in public service. The most meaningful work is work that serves others. But Janet Yellen's story is about more than just economics or career success. It's about what it means to be a Jewish woman in America. Janet's grandparents fled Poland because they were Jewish. They came to America with nothing. They built lives in a country that was better than where they came from, but still didn't fully accept them. Janet's parents grew up in a world where Jews faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education, where elite institutions had quotas to keep Jews out, where you had to work twice as hard to get half as far. And Janet herself faced those barriers, the elite schools that rejected her, the only woman in her PhD program, the decades of being dismissed and underestimated. But she also benefited from something her grandparents didn't have: opportunity. America in the 1950s and 1960s, for all its flaws, was more open than Poland in the 1900s. Public schools were free. Public universities were accessible. The civil rights movement and the women's movement were opening doors. Janet walked through those doors, and then she held them open for others. Her focus on inequality, on the human cost of economic policy, on helping those left behind, it all comes from her Jewish heritage. The Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, repairing the world, the obligation to help those less fortunate, the belief that we're all responsible for each other. Janet never forgot where she came from. She never forgot that her grandparents were refugees, that her parents faced discrimination, that she was rejected from schools because of her last name. And she used her power to make sure that others wouldn't face the same barriers. There's a beautiful symmetry to Janet Yellen's story. It begins with her grandparents, fleeing Poland because they were Jewish, because they weren't safe, because they weren't wanted. And it ends with their granddaughter, controlling the American economy, leading the Treasury Department, shaping policy that affects billions of people around the world, from refugees to the most powerful economic position on the planet. In 2 generations, that's the promise of America. Not that it's perfect, not that it's fair, not that everyone gets an equal chance, but that it's possible, that if you're brilliant and hardworking and persistent and a little bit lucky, you can rise, you can achieve, you can break through barriers that seemed unbreakable. Janet Yellen was rejected from elite schools because she was Jewish. She was the only woman in her PhD program. She was denied tenure at Harvard. She was dismissed and underestimated for decades. And she became the first woman to chair the Federal Reserve, the first woman to lead the Treasury Department, the only person in history to hold all 3 of America's top economic positions. She proved that you don't need to come from privilege to reach the top. You don't need to attend elite schools. You don't need to be part of the old boys network. You need to be brilliant. You need to work harder than everyone else. You need to challenge assumptions. You need to focus on what matters. You need to never give up. And you need to remember, always, that your work is about more than just you. It's about the people you can help, the doors you can open, the barriers you can break down. Janet Yellen's father was a doctor who treated patients in his home, charging what they could afford. He believed healthcare was a right, not a privilege. Janet Yellen became an economist who focused on employment and wages, on helping people get jobs and support their families. She believed that economic policy should serve everyone, not just the wealthy. The values her father taught her, compassion, service, fairness, shaped everything she did. And now, at 78 years old, Janet Yellen is still fighting, still working, still pushing for policies that help real people, because she understands something that many people in power forget, that the purpose of power isn't to enrich yourself, it's to help others. That's the lesson of Janet Yellen's life. That's the lesson of her career. That's the lesson that every entrepreneur, every leader, every person who wants to make a difference should learn. You don't need permission to create value. You don't need to come from privilege to achieve excellence. You don't need to accept the world as it is. You can challenge it. You can change it. You can make it better. Janet Yellen was told she didn't belong. She was rejected from elite schools. She was the only woman in the room. She was dismissed and underestimated. And she became the woman who controls America's money. The question isn't whether you have what it takes to break through barriers. The question is whether you're willing to keep going when everyone tells you to stop. Janet Yellen kept going. For 50 years, she kept going, and she changed the world.